Welcome to Talk South Asian to Me. My name is Michelle.
And my name is Anusha. Tune in every Thursday at 5 p.m. Central and hear us react to each other's stories about mental health and growing up in different South Asian households.
And remember, this podcast is not therapy. Engage with what feels entertaining and resonates with you and leave what doesn't. All right. Are we ready for our next topic reveal for the alphabet I?
I. Let's hear it.
Yes. Okay. So it is integration, a bicultural experience.
Love it
Lots
already.
of big words. Yes.
Yeah.
So we'll first break it down and I'll kind of share some research that I found about this topic and we'll connect it to South Asian experience and we'll go into our experiences. Does that sound cool?
Absolutely.
Yeah, it does. Just by hearing those words, integration, bicultural experience, do you have any other words that come to your mind right away?
Yeah, acculturation.
That's a good one. I'm going to be talking
Right.
about that one.
Yeah.
Anything
Merging.
else? Merging, okay.
No, I'm just naming synonyms.
It is, like I said, it's pretty jargony, right? Like it's some words that it's important for us to break down.
Yeah.
And so I'll be defining biculturalism, which is related to bicultural experience, and then integration, and then I'll go into a few more definitions that are related to integration. So according to the dictionary.com, biculturalism means the presence of two different cultures in the same country or region. It could be further broken down for like a person experiencing two different cultures within their same geographic location or identifying with two different cultures. Okay. And then I found this really great written article. The author's name is Shabnam Ali, published in 2020 online. It's titled Biculturalism and a Distorted Identity Within the Young South Asian Diaspora. And Ali, the author of this article, defines integration by saying, Ali also references the bidimensional model of acculturation that was derived in 1994 by Berry. So Ali kind of uses that definition to define integration, which is, quote, the individual maintains their own cultural identity while at the same time becoming a participant in the host culture. So if you think about like immigrants, right, when they have their origin culture that they identify with, and then they immigrate to a host country, so they have that new culture, the culture of the host country. So integration is the successfully maintaining your own cultural identity that you came with, but then you're also maintaining and becoming a participant successfully in the host culture. So it's kind of like a balance.
Yeah, I like that.
And I saw this statistic on psychologytoday.com, which I thought was pretty interesting. According to the 2020 U.S. Census report, 33.8 million people reported sharing more than one race or ethnicity, aka 33.8 million people experience biculturalism.
Yeah.
Which is so, like, look at that number, right? Like 33.8 million, that's so many.
Wow.
And so those are kind of like some definitions of biculturalism and integration. And now I really wanted to, psychologytoday.com and Ali, the article that I talked about earlier, really go into that bidimensional model of acculturation. And I think it's really important for us to hit on that because it talks about how integration can be derived when you are experiencing biculturalism. But if you don't achieve integration, what are the other alternatives that can occur? So there's this model describes 4 ways that a person can retain their identity when biculturalism occurs. So we talked about integration. That's one, where you maintain your own identity, but then also participate in the host culture.
That
2,
balance.
Yeah, the balance. And then the second one is separation, which means that you completely reject your involvement with the host culture. So you're very isolated. You're in your own community. You find your own people and kind of congregate and like focus on that.
Okay.
Assimilation, which I'm sure you've heard of, right, is the individual gives up on their own cultural identity and becomes focused on the host culture. And I'll talk a little bit more
Wow.
about that. Yes.
So
So,
assimilation is actually not a balance then. It's to tip the scales the other way.
mm-hmm.
Oh, wow. I didn't
Yeah.
even know that. Okay.
I mean, that's what this model talks about, is that these
Uh-huh.
are the different categories of
Right.
biculturalism.
Mm-hmm.
But and then marginalization, which is does not identify or participate with either culture. So you're kind of not,
Oh.
you're kind of completely isolated. So we have
Mm-hmm.
these four spectrum, or four, categories of the spectrum, and we can look at it like a spectrum, right? Like just like any
Mm-hmm.
other categories we've talked about before. It's not like set in stone for anyone.
Yeah.
And we can probably think about, right, when people are moving and immigrating, a lot of these category, or the category they might choose, may depend on their survival and how they can fit the best,
Sure.
right? You left when you immigrate to a new country, you kind of leave everything behind, your ideals, and you're entering a strange new land that you haven't
Mm-hmm.
been to. And so sometimes a lot of immigrant families will kind of go toward assimilation to help
Mm.
them blend in more easily and avoid
Sure.
conflict, avoid racial attacks, and live in harmony, live in it peacefully.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so assimilation is actually related to like the Western ideals that we see in many cultures, including the South Asian culture, right? Like the light
Mm.
skin, importance of learning English, right? All of that
Sure.
has to do with that.
Mm-hmm.
So I wanted to kind of go into the idea of biculturalism. And I wanted to ask you this question. Now that we kind of know the definition, kind of learned a little bit about some background about biculturalism and how people can identify with biculturalism and how they choose to combine or not combine their identities, do you feel like there are, if are disadvantages or advantages of biculturalism, and what do you think that those are?
Mm. Very interesting question.
Yes, it's kind of heavy, so you can think about it,
Okay.
right? Like a person, right, has two
Mm.
cultures. What do you think they're feeling, or what are some disadvantages that they may experience, or what are some advantages that they experience?
Mm. Well, that's pretty loaded question, but I'll give you a bullet point version. So,
There we go.
I
Perfect.
think that some of the like the pros, the benefits of being someone who holds two cultures is that you get to hold two cultures, which means that
Mm-hmm.
you get to experience more than one person gets to experience, right? Holding only one
Exactly.
culture. So you and I'll talk a little bit about this when I talk about my story too, but for me that meant that I had to learn eventually when I felt alienated from like kind of both of the cultures, westernization versus, what we left when we left India. I had my own journey of coming to the place of empowerment of, well, you know what? I get two cultures to choose from, and I get the best of
Mm-hmm.
both of them. And I don't need to engage in the ones that don't feel good or feel like the more like worse off pieces of both cultures. Because, every culture has good things, every culture has bad things. So, in
Mm-hmm.
having a dual cultural opportunity, I get to choose the best of both worlds and I get to
Yeah.
mold it to work for me and my authenticity. So I think that's a
Yeah.
pretty big benefit that sometimes is a little bit hard for people who hold bicultural identity to get to.
Yeah. I like that you had created that mindset of like a privilege. Like it's a
Yeah.
privilege to be able to hold these two cultures.
Yeah.
Do you feel like anybody who shares that bicultural identity feels at a disadvantage, or
Oh,
like,
100%. I'm sure at
yeah.
one point or the other, I would even guess like nearly all of us probably felt like the disadvantage of
Mm-hmm.
it, which is to not be able to feel wholly 100% a part of something, right? Because
Yes.
we can't really claim any one thing, right? It doesn't feel
Mm-hmm.
authentic. Feels like, typical bicultural experiences, you grow up with one culture, but then you are immersed in a different culture. So typically what ends up happening is you're to the other culture for one culture and then to this culture for that culture. So
Yeah.
you don't really feel enough of a sense of like belongingness. Like, these are my people. It doesn't feel like your
Exactly.
people.
It's
So
confusing.
yeah, and like I think that's one of
Yeah.
the biggest disadvantages of a bicultural experience is straddling the two worlds and not feeling you belong anywhere.
Yeah. No, for sure.
Yeah.
That's 100%. Like that's exactly what I read up on too when I was like looking into this.
Mhm.
Thought there's greatly enough because there's so many people that experience this,
Yeah.
whatever you want to call it. There's article titles I saw like identity crisis or bicultural experience, right?
Mhm.
It can manifest in people in many different ways. Like you said, it can cause confusion, cause
Sure.
uncertainty, create a sense of not belonging,
Mhm.
right? Like you're confused. And then having some like struggling with the idea of like, quote, like fitting in.
Mhm.
And when I was reading there on it, there was a Psychology Today article that quoted a 19-year-old second generation Indian American on their
Mhm.
experience. And so I'm going to read their quote real quick. It says, being bicultural makes me feel special and confused.
Mhm.
Special because it adds to my identity. I enjoy my Indian culture. I feel that it is rich in tradition, morality, and beauty. Confused because I have been in many situations where I feel being both cultures isn't an option. My cultures have
Mhm.
very different views on things like dating and marriage. I feel like you have to choose one or the other.
Mhm.
And I thought that was pretty profound of like a 19-year-old sharing that experience.
Mhm.
They're still
Yeah.
well into like entering their adulthood, the beginning of their adulthood.
Still teens, yeah.
Yeah. And
Mhm.
I, I thought that was kind of helping us understand the advantages and advantages in a very
Yeah.
unique way because when I was reading a little bit more about what the advantages are, I read some things like social and cognitive flexibility, empathy. Another big
Mhm.
research finding of an advantage for biculturalism was perspective taking. Like people who
Absolutely.
share a bicultural identity, it's easier for them to consider alternative perspectives and show
Sure.
empathy and be able to take
Yeah.
different perspectives, which is so cool, like to think about it that
Mhm.
way as well. But of
Yeah.
course, that confusion part is really important to consider too. And I really
Mhm.
liked how the person that I just quoted, the 19-year-old, kind of talks about how you have to choose one or the other because there's so many differences when it comes to,
Yeah.
especially the Indian culture that they describe, right? When it
Right.
comes to dating and marriage and differing views.
Yeah. It
Yeah.
actually reminds me of a conversation I had with a client yesterday, and we were talking about his recent trip to India, and he was saying like he just felt like so much social interaction that his sense of belongingness, his sense of like just social interaction was just that cup was filled to the brim. That when he's here, I mean, he's an adult. Most of his
Mm-hmm.
friends are scattered.
Mm-hmm.
As an adult, it is harder to make friends. You have to try extra hard. It's
Yeah.
not like in school. And so
Yeah.
he was starting to notice like, wow, like this is really hard. Like I feel so distant from people. I don't feel as connected. And so we got
Yeah.
into a conversation about exactly this. In America, we tend to value our independence, we tend to value our boundaries. In
Mm-hmm.
India, people don't really have that much boundaries. They tend to
Yes.
be more of a collectivist culture, which again, we were talking about this very idea of so which is better? And the answer is neither. The
Mm-hmm.
answer is somewhere in the middle. We want to have some degree of a sense of belongingness. We want to, work towards something with other people, but at the same time, it's also nice to have boundaries, to have some alone time and
Exactly.
to have independence.
Yeah.
So,
100%.
the idea that we all kind of feel like this very profound statement by this 19-year-old about sometimes feeling like you have to choose, I think that's a pretty, you know, uh,
Accurate.
normal response, right? You
Mm-hmm.
feel like you're
Mm-hmm.
stuck. It's like this or that.
Mm-hmm.
But I think
And
you okay, I'm gonna finish. But I
go
think you
ahead, go
can
ahead.
find, that middle of how can I incorporate both of these things, pieces of both that I like, and then run with it. It's gonna be super uncomfortable though, because the thing about
Mm-hmm.
being a bicultural person is you're the first person who is bicultural,
Yes.
which means you're the first person breaking these barriers. And
Mm-hmm.
that's going to bring pushback from the people in your life. And that always sucks. It's a lot of responsibility and it's a burden to
Yeah.
bear.
Yeah, for sure. And to your point, you when I was reading that article by Shabnam Ali, like at the end,
Mm-hmm.
this author gave so many examples of like people in media that have shown successful integration, like, Jay Sean, like combining the different music that he's created,
Mm.
right? Or like
Yeah.
they reference a baker in the Great British Baking Show, the
Mm-hmm.
great, or what is it called? I keep forgetting the title of that show. Do you know what I'm talking about?
The
Is that the right
Great
name?
Baking Show? Honestly, it sounds right. I don't know.
Yes. But that the famous Netflix show,
Yeah.
like, it was just
Mm-hmm.
it was cool to like see those different examples, but then the author goes into like validating like you're not alone, like there's a lot of people
Mm-hmm.
that feel that sense of confusion and sense of having a hard time fitting in and having to choose, like you mentioned, right? And the person who shared that quote mentioned, but the author also went into how biculturalism is not
Mm-hmm.
only like maintaining and participating in your own cultural heritage and identity, and participating in the host, but it's
Mm-hmm.
combining both and creating your own sense of identity with
Yeah.
that, which
Mm-hmm.
is leads to that integration. Is that
Yeah.
how are you like sometimes like you said there has to be times where you have to choose one or the other, but then how are you looking at it together as well? Or how are
Mm-hmm.
you setting those boundaries if we need to, right? Or
Mm.
how are we how are we fitting those pieces together in our own
Yeah.
lives, which was
Yeah.
interesting. Yeah.
Exactly. Mm.
So that was kind of like my research slash background. Do you feel
Mm-hmm.
like I missed anything? Want to add anything?
Mm. So one thing I would add maybe is I've recently heard about a new term. Like we talk
Mm.
you probably heard like first generation, second generation.
Yes. Yes.
So there's a lot of confusion around that like verbiage,
Yes.
right? So what's more commonly um defined as first generation is being born in a different country and migrating. Second
Mm-hmm.
generation is being born in the like host country.
Mm-hmm.
There's a new term that I've recently heard, and it's called 1.5 generation. So
What? I
that
have not
one,
heard of that.
yeah, I've
Oh.
recently heard of it. And apparently, it's a term that was created for people who are born in you know, a home country, not host country, but migrated to the host country early.
Oh.
Yeah. Because I guess
1.5. Like
it didn't
you
feel
were raised
enough.
in the host country with the
Exactly, quite young. Yeah,
okay.
from your young
Yes.
age, but you were still born elsewhere.
Wow. That's
Yeah.
interesting. Thanks
Yeah.
for sharing. I had never heard of that before.
I
That's
recently
cool.
discovered this term.
Yes. 1.5 generation.
Yeah. I kind of
Is there
like
like
that
a
though.
cutoff at what age? Like, is it like
That's a great
3, 4,
question.
5? Okay.
I heard this more word of mouth, so I
Hmm.
didn't read this anywhere, so I'm not quite sure. Maybe there is
Okay.
though.
Yeah. But, it's out there, right?
Yeah.
Okay. You ready for my kind of experience with
I'm
this?
ready.
Okay.
So ready.
So I would say, I'm second generation. So my parents immigrated, but I was born in the US, right? Is that the
Mhm.
correct way to say that?
Uh-huh.
Did I use
Yeah.
the term correctly? Okay,
Oh
good.
yeah.
So as the second generation, but parents that are first generation, they kind of had a lot of that they shared a lot of the cultural identity from their home country, right? In
Mm.
Pakistan and my dad in Bangladesh. And I feel like growing up in the Western world, in the US, I felt like a minority in my classrooms. I mean, in the area I
Mm.
lived, I was in a suburb, so there were people
Yeah.
that looked like me, like in my school, but it wasn't like as much as like the other races in my and so I did feel like a minority, and so
Yeah.
I feel like I naturally, because of the kid who wanted to fit in, I started assimilating and wanted to like get like the best Aeropostale sweatshirt or the Hollister sweatshirt
Mm.
or
Yeah.
like the latest Western clothes trends. Like, I want to participate in that. That's like what I was really focused
Mm-hmm.
on.
Yeah.
And it was interestingly enough to like, while that was happening with me internally, my
Mm-hmm.
mom was actually the opposite. Like, I would say she kind of
Oh.
took the path of integration, which
Mm-hmm.
was, now looking back, is really inspiring. So she's a nurse and she works in a hospital. She's a minority employee as a Pakistani, but she never shies away from talking about and sharing about her culture with her
Mm-hmm.
employees. If any patients ask, like, she's never embarrassed about it. She's willing to share about it. Her hospital usually does like an annual culture day. So she's
Oh.
always like very eager to participate in it. And she would involve me in the annual culture day every single year, ever since I was in
Mm.
elementary school.
That's sweet.
And in the beginning, like when I was young, right, like really focused on assimilation, I would always despise it. I would be annoyed
Mm.
at it.
Yeah.
I would feel embarrassed. I would feel
Mm.
like, I'm not, like, it's different. And I didn't like that at that time. And it
Mm-hmm.
saddens me now that I think about it, because I was like, like, little Michelle, come on, like, diversity, like, it's so cool. Like, it's a privilege, right? Like,
Yeah.
but at that time, like, that wasn't ideal to me. And I didn't
Yeah.
like the idea of me dressing up, talking about the Pakistani Indian snacks that my mom would be
Yeah.
sharing during culture day. And
Mm.
now that I'm older, I'm like really proud and happy that, like, looking back, that my mom didn't choose to assimilate, right?
Mm.
Like, fully assimilate, right? It's a spectrum. But
Mm-hmm.
and she chose to kind of really shine and use her culture as a strength to build diversity
Mm.
in her workplace.
Yeah.
And so I feel like she is a really great, beautiful, and true example of integration with that. And I
Mm.
appreciate it now that she included me in those, and I'm glad I went along with it, even if it was dreadfully at that time.
Right.
And, recently, maybe like a year and a half ago, I participated in my mom's culture day recently, and helped. My sister and I both helped and participated. We dressed up, and it was
Oh.
around Ramadan. So like we gave dates and things like that and
Yeah.
explained that. So it was like really cool to like educate. And now I like look at it very differently.
Mm.
And so it's so interesting to like see myself change that mindset about my
Yeah,
own
that nice
culture.
full
And
circle moment.
mhm.
Mm.
And I think still struggle sometimes, like, with my unconscious bias and like
Sure.
the hardcore of so many years of trying to assimilate. And I'm
Yeah.
trying to actively undo that mindset and start working
Yeah.
toward my own sense of integration. And example of a small, very, very tiny example of that is I
Mm.
recently traveled for a work conference, and we had
Mm.
to wear business casual clothes every day. It was like four
Uh-huh.
or 5 days long. And with my business casual clothes, I decided to wear jhumkas with my outfit.
Stop! I love that.
Yes, and I felt so good about it. And it was really
Wait,
funny
wait,
because,
look.
oh my gosh, look at
I'm
that.
wearing a jumka.
Yes, they're so
I
cute.
love that.
And so it was really funny. I was like,
Mm.
I brought it with me. I'm so thankful I did. But I had like two
Yeah.
options. I had like the gold hoops and the gold jhumkas that would match. And I was like, which
Oh.
one should I wear? Like, I had it in front of me when I was getting ready for my day that
Yeah.
day. And I was like, I don't know. I don't know. And I asked my friend that's there, who also really embraces and appreciates diversity. And they said to go with the jhumkas too. And we're very
I love
supportive. And I
that.
was like, okay, that's it. Like, I'm doing it. And I like wore it with
Yay.
pride the whole day, from like
Oh.
morning to evening. And it felt so good.
Mm.
Even it was really, really tiny, right? A tiny act, but it was really like, it felt good to me.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes.
That's like
Yes.
really just feeding your inner child this like
Yes.
beautiful integration that you didn't feel like you could get when you were younger. It's so beautiful. Yay.
Yes. Thanks. So that's my story. A little bit about
Oh.
like biculturalism and integration.
Mm, I love that. And it's so funny that Jumkas is the way that you thought about it, because that's how I started my like small integration too. I mean,
Yeah.
there were other ways, but like this is one of the ways that I actively think about it now, and like how I
Mm-hmm.
approach day-to-day life is like I think about I really, really like I love jumkas. I think they're so
So
beautiful and like
elegant.
gorgeous. And like
Yes.
my mother-in-law got me this one and I'm obsessed with it.
Oh.
And so
They're
like
so
I wear
cute.
these on my casual outfits when I'm trying to be like, you know what? I feel a little disconnected from my culture. I'm gonna wear jumkas
Yes,
on
rock
casual
them.
wear. So I love that that's what you were thinking too. Great minds, our
Yes,
wavelengths.
great minds. Woohoo.
Okay. Well, I love that you shared, your experience with that, because I feel like that's a very similar experience that we all have, right? Like we want to fit in, and like we kind of tend to feel like almost embarrassed or like shame about
Mhm.
like our
Mhm.
culture, and we tend to like
Mhm.
try to almost like overcompensate in this way. But
Yeah.
our parents typically, like, typical story, right? Maybe it's not everyone's story, but like parents typically don't. They kind of stand their ground. They want to still incorporate pieces of culture, incorporate pieces
Mhm.
of like their home. And I think that it's such a like a universal thing, this idea of like, so embarrassed, and like we come
Yeah.
around to it eventually, and we're like, you know what, go you.
Yeah.
That's so
Exactly.
beautiful.
It
Go
is.
auntie. Well, I have kind of a similar story. Obviously. I had a lot of specific things come up for me though. So for example, I remember, I'll tell you like a couple of snippets of memories.
Okay.
I remember one time, I think this was in elementary school. I was pretty young.
Mhm.
I think so. Every summer I go back to India for like 3 months.
Mhm. Yes.
I'm a 1.5 Gen kid.
Generate. Okay.
I was born in India, but I moved here when I was like 3, 4-ish. So I was like basically brought up and grown up here. But I still like had very, very strong connection back home to in India, because I went back like almost every summer for like nearly 3 months at a time. Or my
Mhm.
grandparents would visit for 3 months at a time. So I was like really immersed in both these cultures all the time.
Mhm.
And I remember, I think this was fresh off of coming from a trip to India. I remember talking to teachers during an after school program or something like that. And I was like, oh, I need to go change my clothes. And I kept saying that again and again and again, because they were like, we need a what? I was like, I need to change my clothes. They're like, you're what? And it just kept going on and on. Eventually, I got so frustrated. I was like, why are they not understanding me? That I was like, clothes. And I was like gesturing to my clothes. And it was like, I think the first time when I was that young that it hit me, like, there's something like different about the
Mm.
way that I say things. There's something different about the way that I am, compared to like the host culture. I think that was the first real example where it really hit me of like, I'm different. And I don't know, like it was definitely like that moment really stuck with me for such a long
Mm.
time. And clearly, even now, because I'm thinking about it, but
Yeah.
it really did stick with me, this idea of, okay, you're different. And like that just kept going on from there. And things like, I didn't really listen to like American music until middle school. Like it never really
Oh.
bothered me until middle school, and I was like, "Oh wait, this is weird, right? Like I'm not listen I don't know these songs that people are talking about." Because before
Interesting.
then I
I
would
didn't know
probably only
that
listen to
about
like
you.
Indian songs. Yeah.
Yeah.
I didn't start until middle school. Um and this one you will know. So, do you remember in high school, like I I had the weirdest, like, oddest habit. I would eat underneath the table. Like I would hold my food underneath the cafeteria table and just like kind of take bites as we talked.
Okay. I kind of remember this. I feel like I
I'm pretty
questioned
sure
you on
you're
it
the one
too.
who called me out on it though.
I feel like I questioned you on it too. Like, what are
Yeah,
you
I think so. You were like, "What are you doing? Put your food on the
doing?
table."
Yeah.
And it was just a habit that I picked up somewhere along the road. I have no idea when I brought food from home. Like it was delicious, but like it would be really yellow because of the turmeric, or
Mm.
it would smell like something different than like American food, right? So like people would
Yeah.
obviously be like, "What are you eating? What is that?" Even if it wasn't like
Mm.
rude or malicious, it was just curiosity. It just made you feel like different, right? So like
Yeah, for
I
sure.
would get into the habit, and I didn't even know I was doing this. I would get into the habit of like putting my food underneath the table and like hiding the way it looked, but eating it.
Mm. Yeah.
And it was like the weirdest thing, because I never knew until you called me out and you're like, "What are you doing?" And I was like, "Oh, I don't know."
It's okay to eat all the food. I know,
Well,
like, I
now
feel
I
like
would.
Yeah, no, but I understand where you were coming from. Like you're different, like you said, you were realizing you're
Yeah.
different and you were doing what you felt like you that would help you survive
Yeah.
and help you
It was
fit
just
in.
constant reminders that you're different. So you
Mm-hmm.
do as much as you can, especially at that age, right? All you want to
Mm-hmm.
do at that age is fit in. You don't want to stand
Exactly.
apart until you get
Yes.
older. And then you're like, I
Yeah.
want to be unique.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
you don't hit that till later.
Exactly.
Um, yeah. So those were kind of like the biggest ways that I felt like I was pretty much different. I wasn't really allowed to, we talked about sleepovers, not really allowed to do
Mm-hmm.
sleepovers. My parents
Mm-hmm.
never felt comfortable with me wearing like shorts, and I didn't until like college. Um,
Mm-hmm.
I also, unless it was for school gym shorts. The most embarrassing thing though I will always cringe though. I mean, I'm different now. I'm an evolved
Yeah.
person. But I would have cringed is my parents or my mom didn't let me like shave often, like my legs.
Mm.
And I'm not just a South Asian, I'm a South Indian. We are hairy and we got thick hair. I needed to be able to shave, right?
Yeah.
Like that was a
Yeah.
normal thing in
Mm-hmm.
host culture. It's not really a big deal actually in like Indian culture though, as far as I'm aware.
Mm-hmm.
So, and it's not, mom had like some concerns of like over, shaving would lead to like, I don't know,
Mm-hmm.
thicker hair, like, all the myths and stuff.
Yeah.
So I was only allowed to do it once a week. But as I said, I have very thick hair. I'm a South
Yeah.
Indian, which meant mine
Yeah.
grew like this fast. And so I
Yeah.
had to like walk around, run around gym. And here was again yet another reason that I felt clearly alienated and like
Mm.
different. So like all of these
Yeah.
things just add up enough that eventually I started convincing myself that I needed distance from like Indian culture. Like it was too much. I
Mm.
didn't want it. I didn't need it. There wasn't a place for it. And that's kind of how I approached it most of the time. Um unless I was in India. Then I was like, okay, this is fine. But when I was here, I didn't really want to acknowledge that part of me. Um
Mm.
at least in school. Outside
Yeah.
of school, I did like a lot of kuchipudi, which is like one of the Indian classical dance forms. I
Mm-hmm.
did that. I dressed up all the time on the weekends, but school time, weekdays were like a hard no for like Indian
Mm-hmm.
things for me, especially when I was
Yeah.
in school. And then eventually going to college and like, therapy and going through the journey of like reconnecting with culture, like I found a
Mm-hmm.
way to find a balance, to find a sense of empowerment that that we were talking about earlier of what are some things that you can really appreciate and have gratitude and like love and embody that are part of your
Mm-hmm.
culture. What are some things that you don't really like but maybe you prefer that the host culture does, right? So for example, I found my balance in being able to celebrate certain festivals like Diwali or Holi
Yeah.
while
Yeah.
also getting to celebrate and like I love Christmas. I like
Yeah.
outdo myself for Christmas all the time.
I
I'm
love
crazy
it.
about it. So
Yes. Yeah.
finding a way like culturally or through media representation, like I love Bollywood movies. Less so now.
Mm-hmm.
Back in the 90s maybe more so. But
Yes.
I love
Same.
Bollywood movies. I love, like Hollywood movies. I love Tollywood movies. I love music from, both the cultures, just kind of finding my balance within all that. And of course, just like you, my jumkas, wearing them more
Yes.
often.
Yes. That's so
So,
good.
yeah, I mean, it's a evolving journey, I think, though. Like, even while I was finding my balance within it all, there were still some moments when I had like a deep, deep sense of distaste for the way some things are done in India, for the way some, like politically speaking and just like other things,
Mm-hmm.
the way certain things are allowed to happen
Mm-hmm.
back
Mm-hmm.
home. So it's a constant journey,
Yeah.
your sense of identity and like our bicultural experience is definitely wrapped up in our identity as one intersectional piece of that identity. So it's an
For
evolving
sure.
thing. We're not going to
It
always have the
is.
same relationship. I'm going to continuously be moving along that spectrum of balanced to not really balanced to,
Yeah,
other side of that balance, but that's okay. That's kind of life.
that is life. We're all constantly changing. We're
Yeah.
human beings. It's the human experience. I really liked how you kind of gave those different examples of the way, like you gave those specifics about
Yeah.
like some of them that you shared from school. Like I didn't know. Like I had no idea that you hadn't listened to American music. I would have never
No.
guessed that, like American
Yeah.
music. And I feel like the little Anusha that would hide her food and eat uncomfortably. Like I want to go back to her and be like,
Yeah.
I'm gonna eat this with you. We're gonna have
Yeah.
yellow fingers together. Right?
You're so sweet. Yeah.
Yes.
Exactly.
But you're right. Like it's an evolving relationship that we have, this
Mm,
biculturalism. Like even when I was reading up on it, like there wasn't one set definition of
mm,
biculturalism,
yeah.
Like that's how complex it is. And
Hmm.
I almost like, just reflecting on what we both shared about our experiences too, like I feel like we also have the privilege of living through time in media where there is more representation
Oh,
of,
yeah.
our culture in media. Like, of course, there's more work that needs to be done still, but there is starting to
Mm,
be.
yeah.
And I feel like the Western world, some accurate and inaccurate ways, is starting to appreciate our
Hmm.
culture, which
Mm,
is also probably helps and boosts some people's journey to integration.
hmm. Oh, yeah.
I mean, we've talked about this before too. Like cultural appropriation is still there, and of course, there's accurate and inaccurate ways of appreciating the culture that we share. But
Yeah.
I'm sure, like the attention that we're getting, the new products, the golden milk, and like
I
all
was
of
literally
this,
thinking that.
right? Right? Like all these things, like yoga and Ayurvedic medicine, like all of
Mm,
these things like are starting to come about in medicine. But to think back, when I used to show up with oil in my hair in school or things like that,
mm,
like it wasn't welcomed and it was
yeah.
ridiculed a little bit,
Yeah.
you know? And
Hmm.
like I think that's important to note too, is that it's
Yeah.
been nice to have that privilege of living in a world where we do have representation and now there is some appreciation in the society.
Mm,
But it doesn't take away from what we experienced growing up and that
yeah.
struggle that we still experience every day of having to choose or
Hmm.
having to battle between the different ideals.
Mm,
So I think it's really important to consider those things too. It's so interesting to me.
absolutely. And I would even go so far as to say, like, it's possible, like, even now, like, the kids who are growing up in this shift of more representation, it's not to say that they're probably not still feeling some semblance of what we felt
Mm-hmm.
too, right? I mean,
Yeah.
just because there's more representation probably doesn't really mean that they're not feeling
Mm-hmm.
the burden of being
No, for sure.
bicultural.
Yeah.
Um, but having said that, I hope that it's easier because,
Yeah.
all I remember from, when we were younger is like very like overly racist tones of representation that
Mm-hmm.
were just like untrue and frankly
Yeah.
almost elicited a sense of shame too.
Mm-hmm.
Like, oh, like that's just that weird culture that does this or that. And it's like,
Mm-hmm.
okay, we're known for more than that, but all right.
Exactly. Like Fair
Whereas
and
now
Lovely.
there's
Do you remember Fair and
right.
Lovely?
Oh my gosh, Fair and Lovely. I love the new campaign now though. Have you seen there's
No.
this amazing artist on I found her on Instagram. I don't know if it's her design or whose design exactly it is, but they started a campaign called Unfair and Lovely and it is
Oh, I like
beautiful.
that. I
Yeah,
love
I
it.
love that. I love
I
it so
love it.
much. But like this is what you get when you have like a whole generation that has this collective trauma is that someone stands up and says, "No, no more." And then that
Mm-hmm.
really builds because it clearly resonates with all of us that those were not okay.
Yeah,
Those were not cool.
for sure. And it's so interesting to see the difference of our biculture experience and our parents. Like,
Yeah. It's a good point.
if like with my experience, I feel like because I was second generation maybe and I was spending more time in school than at home, right? Like that's what we do when we're growing up, like the 8 hours
Mm,
versus like the few hours before you go to bed at home and in the
yeah.
weekends.
Yeah.
Like I was really focused on that fitting in that society, whereas my parents really
Mm.
wanted to hold on to their cultural identity and their heritage. And it
Mm-hmm.
was a struggle to like please both sides, right? Of like which
Mm.
one
Oh yeah.
do I focus on? Which one do I choose? Because at that
Yeah.
time, the idea of integration was still far reach, and it was more
Sure.
like which way do I go?
Yeah. It's a really good point. It also kind of reminds me of like, I don't know if you've also felt this way, but I think it's a pretty general thing. Growing up and like even in college, like I always felt, and even sometimes now, I always feel out of place in both cultures in a sense of like growing up here, I always felt like, oh, you're so Indian and like, oh my God, you're
Mm-hmm.
so cultural and like, why don't you do more like American things? You live here. And like back home though, when I visit so often, it's like, oh,
Yeah.
you're ABCD, which is,
Mm-hmm.
American born
Born
confused
confused,
Daisy.
Daisy. I
Basically a
used to
very
get called that.
derogatory,
Yes.
yeah, a derogatory term of like, you don't know
Yeah.
anything. You're just confused. You don't really belong in your culture. And it's like, well, yeah, I know, but that's not nice of you to say.
Yeah.
Because you are straddling two different cultures and like, yeah, I'm gonna be confused, of course I
Yeah.
am,
Yeah.
but that doesn't mean I'm not Indian. It doesn't mean I'm not
Mm-hmm.
American. Like it doesn't mean that I'm not both of these cultures, right? And
Exactly.
yet both the cultures felt I wasn't enough of them.
Mm-hmm. And, thinking back a little bit to what you just said too, like before I, before even after, before my first job, which was teaching, I feel like I gravitated toward other South
Mm-hmm.
Asians. And I was like privileged enough to have that community, like, you know,
Mm-hmm.
growing up in
Really?
elementary school and middle school
Yeah.
and high school, right? And college too. Like I went to a very diverse university that I had that option to be part of associations that were South
Mm-hmm.
Asian focused.
Yeah.
And it was like that that was almost
Yeah.
a way of me trying to hold on to that cultural part, like that culture identity, the South Asian culture
Mm-hmm.
identity of me. And it was really interesting to when I went to my first job, which I was the only South Asian as a teacher in my entire school,
Mm-hmm.
student population
Yeah.
and teach like employee population. Like I was the only South
Mm-hmm.
Asian. That was like truly tested of how much
Yeah.
I want to hold on to my cultural identity. So like we did a
Mm.
culture day
Yeah.
and I wore like a Pakistani outfit. And then
Oh.
majority of my students were bilingual and they were Spanish speaking as well.
Mm.
And so they would like teach me Spanish words and I would teach them Urdu words. And so like it was just so
Oh,
cool to
that's precious.
like it was interesting to see that, okay, like as I'm maturing and growing and I'm moving away from
Mm.
being that comfort zone, being around the South Asian and being easy to practice my skull culture, to where now I have to actively try to balance and actively try to practice my culture, and how
Mm-hmm.
like that progresses over time. Again, that
Yeah.
spectrum is just so interesting, right? Like
Mm.
there's just so many points in our life that we're going to have to like choose, right? Like you said, you choose to wear the jhumkas. Like you don't have to. You can go
Mm.
to your American earrings, style earrings, your hoops, but you're
Yeah.
actively making these choices, which is so cool,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like you're working towards
Yeah.
that integration.
Yeah. And staying, authentic to whatever is authentic in that moment.
Yes, whatever is you
Mm-hmm. Yeah. In that moment. Because that's always going to
in
change.
that
And that's okay.
moment. That's okay. Yeah, exactly.
This was such a fun topic.
It was. It's so
I
like
really
heavy
liked
too
it.
and complex. Like I feel like I can go
Yeah.
forever talking about this, because
I know. Yeah.
biculturalism like plays a role in all aspects of our lives. So
Everything from like
I
our
know.
appearance, our mannerisms, our
Yes.
personalities,
Accents.
everything.
I have an accent.
Accents. Yeah.
I do. I was told that. Like my first language was
Really.
Urdu. Yeah. So
Huh?
my primary language is Urdu. So there's some words that I say that are different
Ah.
in English, the English words. And I'm
Yeah.
like, oh,
Mine
like,
used to be like
yeah.
clothes. I also say like oh my gosh, pecan versus pecan.
Oh,
I feel
yes,
like maybe that's
pecan.
a
I say pecan too.
I I say both. I don't even know which one is what I originally said anymore because I was so
Yes.
like turned around. I remember saying like pecan or pecan. And then at school, everybody was like, "What's that?" And like everyone
Yeah.
corrected me in school. And I was like, "Oh, okay." And then I took it back home, and everyone's like, "What are you saying? That's not
Yeah.
right." And I'm like, "Okay, I
Yeah.
give up."
I don't like when people correct to my English. I'm like, you can't. Like, this is the way I'm going to say this word.
Yeah.
Okay. Like, but
Yeah.
like, I wouldn't say like accent. There's just like different, maybe a few words that like I pronounce differently.
Hmm.
Like when I was younger, I don't say this anymore, but I used to say photography instead of photography,
Oh, yeah, yeah,
or
yeah.
like
Because that's what
I
it
still say
looks like
pasta,
on
but
paper.
I don't think that's pasta. Like, I don't know how the other way to say it is, but I say pasta.
Is that not right?
I don't know. I've been corrected on
I
that.
don't know. Okay. All right, then.
Right?
I
Like
think
you
that,
said.
yeah.
No, no, go
No,
ahead. Go
continue.
ahead. I was just
No,
saying,
no, you
like you
continue,
said,
man.
like there's just so many aspects of our life that we can keep going on and on
Oh
and
my
on and
gosh.
on.
Endless. I know. So endless. But I was going to say, kind of thinking about names, like that reminded me, like, when I think of integration and I think of names, what comes to mind almost immediately is like other people pronouncing our names.
Ooh, it's a big one.
I actually, I don't want this person to feel bad, so I'm not going to call out too many details here. But I had a person refuse to say a name as it was meant to be said, a grown adult, and this adult said,
No,
well, I'm going to say it the way that other white people are going to say it. And I was like, I was so taken aback. And this
no.
was a recent example
Oh
that
no.
happened like this year. I was so taken aback and confused. I was like, okay.
And
But
your
it's
name is
like
your identity. Like that's big. I'm
a name.
sorry that you had
It
to
wasn't
deal
my
with
name.
that.
It was a name. I don't want to
Okay.
say too much.
Yeah.
But yeah, it was just so confusing to me.
Yeah, that's not okay.
It's like, it's different. It's not like a word like pasta or photography or like, it's not a word, a thing. It's a person's
It's a
name, and the name is a part of your
name.
identity. And like,
It's
that just feels
huge.
like basic respect when you try to say a name and you don't know. Like, that's okay. No shame in that. You didn't know.
Yeah,
But the least you can do is at least try.
exactly. You could try.
Yeah. Because names are another thing that people feel
Yeah,
alienated by, different, othered.
exactly. Othered.
Mm,
It's another way to put it.
yeah.
But
Well,
the
we can
cool
keep
thing
going,
is
but
because a lot of people feel
mm,
this way, even though in your moment and in that moment you might feel alienated and othered, you're not alone in
mhm,
feeling that way, right? It's
yeah.
important to think that,
Hmm.
acknowledge that.
Absolutely.
Exactly.
All right. Shall
All
we
right.
wrap up? I truly
Yes.
feel like this is a conversation we will go
Yes.
endlessly about.
Yes, we can. Well, let's wrap up.
Okay. Well, I want to end our podcast with our usual reminder. If our podcast resonated with you and you'd like to share your story with us about your integration stories or your experience, if it was similar, if it was different, anything you want to share, or even ask us any questions, you can reach out to
Yes.
us at talksouthasiantome@gmail, or you can find us on literally all the socials at our handle at talksouthasiantome.
Woohoo. We would love to hear from you all.
And we're excited because we're actually going live soon. Yay!
Yes. All right.
But next time we come back, we will come back to Jay.
Yes.
Alrighty. Well, we'll
Okay.
see everybody at Jay. Bye.
Okay. Bye.